Hello, my name is Safari Salmon Mijage from Edukea Tanzania. Welcome in this session in History 2 Advanced level. The topic so-called the rise of socialism. On the last session, dear students, we ended on the reasons for third world countries to adapt socialism. So now we are going to see the impacts of the crisis of socialism. The impacts of the crisis of socialism. After the collapse of socialism in Eastern Europe led by USSR, in early 1990s, the following effects were seriously noted in the world. It means we are going to see the effects that was resulted by the collapse of USSR, the leading socialist nation in Eastern Europe and the world. The first one, or the first effects, was the collapse. The collapse led to the end of Cold War politics between the Eastern following socialism and the Western following capitalism. It means that the collapse led to the end of Cold War politics. Cold War politics that was comprising or involving two superpowers. It means socialism in one side with USSR and the capitalism on the side of USA. So after the collapse of USSR in 1990, it means that the world witnessed that the Cold War politics was turned over, or it was ended, because the other side, which was the superpower as a socialist nation, was collapsed, or the Soviet Union was collapsed by that time, and that led to the end of the Cold War in the world. Another one, the collapse of Russia led to attainment of German reunification, which before the collapse of Germany was divided in West and under socialist ideology, and East under the capitalist ideology. It means that the collapse of Russia led to the attainment of Germany reunification, which before the collapse Germany was divided in West under socialist ideology, and whereby the two independent nations were divided by the Berlin Wall, was officially removed on 3rd October 1990 to allow the free movement of people from West Germany and from West Germany to East Germany, and vice versa is true. So that's why it means we can say that the collapse of USSR in 1990, it means that led to the reunification of Germany. That was before the collapse of USSR. Germany was divided into two parts, meaning that Western part under socialist ideology and the Eastern part of Germany under the capitalism ideology. So that that removed the Berlin Wall, that in 3rd October 1990, and they allowed the free movement of people to two parties, which were Western German and the Eastern German, and Germany became one again, and that was the result of the collapse of USSR in 1990. Another effect was the collapse of socialism led to the collapse of the Warsaw Pact. It means that the collapse of USSR led to the collapse of Warsaw Pact. It means that the military alliance that was formed under USSR in order to protect and to secure the socialism or socialist countries that was formed by USSR. It means it was declined or collapsed soon after the collapse of USSR. So the Warsaw Pact that was formed as the response of the formation of NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization by USA, to me that Warsaw Pact was collapsed soon after the collapse of USSR. Because no one particular state out of the 50 states which disintegrated or collapsed from the former USSR and remained responsible for the Warsaw Pact. Even Russia became the member of NATO, which the Western camp of capitalism ideology. To mean that after the collapse of USSR, even Russia, which was the main founder of Warsaw Pact, decided to join in North Atlantic Treaty Organization. To mean that NATO and the Warsaw Pact remained idle, and that led to its collapse, and that was the result of the disintegration or collapse or decline of USSR in the early of 1990. Another effect of the collapse of USSR was the 1991 Gulf War against Iraq, where the East, especially Russia, joined with the West to fight against President Saddam Hussein of Iraq, who invaded and annexed the Kuwait. It means that the 1991 Gulf War against Iraq, where the East, especially Russia, joined with the West to fight against President Saddam Hussein of Iraq, who invaded and annexed Kuwait. You can see that the collapse of USSR, it means that those socialist countries started to join Western countries in the war. As you can see that during the Gulf War of 1991, it means the Eastern countries like Russia, that was among of the USSR Union, decided to join the war to fight against the President of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, who invaded and annexed Kuwait, and that was another effect of the collapse of USSR in the early of 1990. But another impact was, it means, led to the assassination of the former communist leader who were in front line to practice workers' dictatorial government proposed by the Karl Marx. For example, in Romania, whereby Nicholas Sees and his wife Ellen were assassinated by followers of the capitalism ideology or capitalist ideology or system on 23rd December 1990. It means that the collapse of USSR led to the assassination of the former communist leaders who were in front line to practice workers' dictatorial government proposed by Karl Marx. For example, in Romania, in the year of 1990, 23rd December, there was the event whereby whereby Nicholas Sees and his wife Ellen were assassinated by the capitalist ideology followers, so as to diminish the socialism and the communism at all. And that was another effect of the decline of USSR in the early of 1990. But another effect was the collapse of the former USSR led to the decline of one political system of the East. After the collapse of socialism in USSR, the East, with the socialism ideology, dissolved the system of following one political party, and the room was opened for liberal democracy, which insisted on multi-party system as the philosophy of the West. It means that after the collapse of USSR or the former USSR, it means that the decline of political party system in East was, after the collapse of former USSR, the system of monoparty system in the country, especially in Eastern countries, was dissolved, because that system was propounded by the USSR or by the socialism ideology. And that after the collapse of socialism in USSR, the East with socialism ideology dissolved, and the system of following one political party was declined, and that gave the room and to open the liberal democracy, whereby multi-party system was introduced in the different Eastern countries, including Russia, whereby many political parties were established and started to compete in getting the powers in the country. And that was another effect, as it means that the multi-party system was pressurized by the Westerners, and thus after the collapse of USSR, the multi-party system was spreaded in the Eastern countries that were adapting socialism after the collapse of socialism in the area of 1990. Also, the another effects of the collapse of USSR, it means the foreign policies of the East, which were forest cooperation with the West, also changed this. This was because after the collapse of USSR, it witnessed the close cooperation between the East and the West, like IMF, World Bank, and the European Union be invited. They invest in the East, hence penetration of capitalism in Eastern Europe. It means that soon after the collapse of USSR, the foreign policies of the East, which were forest cooperation with the West, was invited, whereby we witnessed that the Westerners were invited to come and invest in the Eastern Europe, as like we can see IMF, World Bank, European Union were invited to invest in the Eastern Europe as soon as the USSR was declined in the early of 1990. Also, another effect that resulted from the collapse of USSR, it means that humanitarian assistance and aids from the West have been directed to the East to save the fallen economic situation in the East. It means that humanitarian assistance and aids from the West was being directed to the East in order to save the foreign economic situations in the Eastern countries. After the collapse of USSR, we witnessed that many Eastern countries was collapsed economically because there are no longer assistance from the Eastern camp or USSR because it was already declined. So the Easterners were suffering economically, and that's why the Western aids and the assistance or humanitarian assistance started to flow towards the Eastern parts. For example, scientific technological assistance have been directed in the East in order to provide essential basic needs and services to the people in the East. You can see that after the collapse of USSR in the 1990, the scientific and technological assistance have been directed toward the East in order to provide essential basic needs and services to the people of East. Another effect of the collapse of USSR, it means that the collapse witnessed the freedom of worship in the East, whereby the massive missionary assistance was directed to the East by the West in order to revive worshiping situation in the East. Thus led people in the East to be free to choose their denomination for worship. It means that the collapse of USSR led to the freedom of worship in the East, whereby massive missionary assistance was directed towards Eastern countries in order to give the room for freedom of worship. As before the collapse of USSR, there were no freedom of worship. It means that the country were dominated by a single religion or denomination, that this will be the state religion, and all people of the state were supposedly to follow that religion as their denomination for worshiping. And that after the collapse of USSR, led to the freedom of worship to the Eastern people. It means that people had the choice to choose their, or had the right to choose their denomination of their wish to worship. That was another, those were the effects that were resulted from the collapse of USSR in the early of 1990. So after looking this, let us see another subtopic, which is the Chinese Revolution of 1949. The Chinese Revolution of 1949. The situation in China before revolution. Let us see the short history or situation in China before revolution. Before the revolution, China was ruled by oppressive and exploitative feudal system which were disliked by the workers. In this feudal class comprised the feudal dynasty or class at home, but also there were imperialist powers which had invested in China. These imperialist powers exploited the workers by giving them low wages, long working hours, and living in poor conditions. To me, that China before the revolution in 1949, it means China, or the majority of people in China, were living under the harsh or miserable life, whereby they were living under poor conditions. It means the workers were paid low wages, and the working hours were long or were lengthened. It means that the workers were working for long hours. We are proceeding to look on the situation before the revolution in China. It means that the serfs were tortured, harassed, and overworked by the landlords. It means that the serfs were tortured, harassed, and overworked by the landlords. It means that the serfs were forced to work for the landlords, also were tortured as well as harassed by their landlords. Also, all the land belonged to the landlords, and the majority of the peasants were landless. Hence, they were obliged to work under the feudal lords, who paid them low wages and made them to work long hours, etc. This increased the enmity among the Chinese. It means that all the land were belonging to the landlords, and the majority of the people were landless, and that's why those majority of peasants were landless, hence they were obliged to work under the feudal lords who paid them. Yes, after looking the effects of the collapse of USSR, so I would like to jump to another subtopic, which is the Chinese Revolution of 1949. As we are proceeding with the Chinese Revolution, and we have seen the situation in China before the revolution. As I've said that all the land belonged to the landlords, and the majority of the peasants were landless, hence they were obliged to work under the feudal lords, who paid them low wages and worked for long hours, and etc. This increased the enmity among the Chinese. Also, the geographical condition. China had the harsh climate condition which led to droughts, famine, hunger, and starvation, but also floods and epidemic diseases were common among the Chinese. To mean that before the Chinese Revolution of 1949, to mean that China the geographical condition of China was harsh. To mean that the climate condition of China was harsh, which led to droughts, famine, hunger, starvation, but also floods and epidemic diseases were common in China, and that were affected much the Chinese population. that was common situation before the revolution of 1949. Also, there were rampant unemployment among the people in China, hence the huge number of majority. The huge number or majority of China had no employment and they lived like beggars. It means that before the revolution, the majority of the people in China, or large number of people in China, were unemployed, and that's why they lived like beggars in their country before the revolution of 1949. And this was the common situation before the revolution. Also, another situation that was common in China before the revolution was there were poor provision of infrastructures and social services in China. For example, there were no good roads, ports, and harbor, telecommunication, no education facilities, which made majority illiterates, and the poor medical care, which led massive death among the people in China. It means that before the revolution of 1949, it means that China had the poor infrastructure and social services were poor. As you can see that there are no good roads, ports and harbor, telecommunication systems, no education facilities that could facilitate the people of China to be educated one. And that situation made the majority of Chinese to be illiterate, and the poor medical care, which led to the massive death among the people in China. And that was the common situation in China before the revolution in 1949. Also, another situation that was common in China, it means that China was highly divided into two classes, whereby at the top there was king, a group of literate landlords, and at the bottom were serfs, who were the majority being exploited by the landlords. It means that before the revolution of 1949, China was divided into two parts, or into two classes, whereby at the top there were the kings, or queen dynasty, queens or kings, group of literate landlords, as well as landlords, and at the bottom were the serfs and the peasants, who were the majority being exploited by the landlords. And that was the common situation also before the revolution in China in 1949. And also, Chinese industries were poorly developed, whereby these industries used low and poor technology, but also industries were unevenly developed and distributed. However, these industries were owned by the capitalists in the West, who invested in China, and therefore industries played a main role in national economy, because they were very backwardness, and they were not only by the people of China rather than foreigners. To me, that the industrial sector in China was still poor. As you can see that the industries that were in China were invested by the foreigners from the West, and that made the Chinese to be not depending much on the industrial sector, because it was playing a minimal role in it. And another situation is that Japan was a traditional enemy of China, where she used it to attack China for raw materials. For example, in 1931, Japan attacked Manchuria, which was the part of China, etc. It means that Japan was was a traditional enemy of China, where she used it to attack China for raw materials. As we can take the example of 1931, where Japan attacked Manchuria, that was the part of China. and introduced the kingdom called the Manchukuo in Manchuria, which was a part of China, and that was another communist situation that was in China before the revolution of 1949. So I would like to wind up our session there and leave the question, which is explain the effects of the collapse of, explain the effects of the collapse crisis of USSR to the world. What were the effects of the collapse of USSR to the world? So until there, I would like to thank you for listening and welcome again.